Ukraine has stopped Russia. Nobody even talks about the Black Sea Fleet anymore. And the Russian Air Force, they drop bombs on Ukrainian cities, but they don't even fly into Ukraine to do that. NATO would get stronger immediately the day that Ukraine joined. Unfortunately, some countries still have this belief that Russia might actually use a nuclear weapon, which I think is not ever going to happen. This war would have ended a year ago if the United States had made the commitment to help Ukraine win, or if the U.S. president had said, we want Ukraine to win because it's in our best interest.
When Russia openly invaded Ukraine, the majority of military experts were highly skeptical about Ukraine's ability to withstand the aggression of what was considered the world's second most powerful army. However, what happened next surprised many around the world as Ukraine demonstrated remarkable resilience. But our today's guest wasn't really surprised, because this is exactly what he predicted before Russia's invasion, based on his deep experience and strategic knowledge. Joining us today is former commanding general of U.S. Army Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges.
Ben Hodges is a military analyst and retired American officer. He was born in 1958 in the United States. He is a graduate of the United States Military Academy. In 1989, he became an instructor at the U.S. Army Infantry School. He served as the commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He also held the position of senior battalion officer in the 101st Airborne Division. Later, he became an aide-de-camp to the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in Europe. Currently, he heads the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis.
General, since the first days of Russian invasion, you were among very few people who predicted that Ukraine would not collapse. What's the biggest misconception about the Russian war in Ukraine today? For example, what do people get wrong about this situation on the front line at this point?
I think, number one, they don't appreciate why people fight. I mean, why Ukrainians are fighting and resisting. It's that war is not just a math problem, it's about will. The second thing they get wrong is I think they don't appreciate the geography and understand the map and look at where, the Russians, where they have had any success and where they have been stopped. And if you can read a map, then you can quickly realize how Russia has failed over the last 11 years. And then the third thing I think is an assumption that because Russia is big and has unlimited natural resources, that therefore their military is going to be big and effective. And clearly that was not the case.
Sir, a lot of our viewers are concerned about the shift in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship and the risks of having the U.S. defense aid to Ukraine being completely stopped. If the worst-case scenario happens, what is the most important thing Europe can do to help Ukraine?
Well, a recognition that it is in the best interest of Europe that Ukraine is successful, that this is not charity for Ukraine, but this is in Europe's own best interests. And I do have the feeling, I live in Frankfurt, I do have the feeling that more and more Europeans are recognizing that this is what has to be done with or without the United States being a part of it.
Based on your observation, for example, in Germany, how did the public opinion about the war in Ukraine shift over time?
Well, of course, in the very beginning, there were very strong support for Ukraine, even though before February 2022, I think most Germans believed that Russia would not actually go through with this. So there was some disbelief before the large-scale invasion. But after the large-scale invasion, Bundeskanzler Scholz, came out with a huge financial announcement. We talked about Zeitenwende, that this was different. And so there was a time where Germans were very supportive. But over the last 3 years, of course, that has waned a little bit because the leadership, as just like in the United States, the leadership did not explain to the population why this was important, why this mattered to us. The Biden administration did not do that, and the Scholz government has not done that. So I think most people, if they believe they're getting accurate, honest information from the government, then they'll understand and they'll follow that. So that's what I would attribute it to. The bottom line is that public sentiment has moved past the emotional stage where there was, horror at what was happening in a European country to civilians, to now we're at there's a lot of things. People are worried about the United States. They're wondering what's going to happen. And of course, they look internally. They worry about their own problems. And so good that Germany now has had a successful election, and they'll have a new government hopefully before the end of April. And they've done some important work already, even before the new government was formed, with this the budget, and Chancellor Merz, or Mr. Merz, who will be the Bundeskanzler, has indicated a large amount of resources to go to Ukraine. And Germany will be the leader in Europe by example. It's the biggest, has the largest economy, and so they don't have to say they're the leader, but the Germans can lead by example, and I think that's what we're going to see.
General, there's this popular narrative that helping Ukraine defend itself only prolongs the inevitable and almost makes Ukraine a warmonger. Based on the fact that Ukraine is fighting the war of attrition, what would you say to people who spread this narrative?
Well, I'd say it's completely wrong. That this war would have ended a year ago if the United States had made the commitment to help Ukraine win, or if the U.S. president had said, we want Ukraine to win because it's in our best interest. It's good for our economy. It's good for security and stability. It prevents a war with NATO, and it will send a message of deterrence to China. Then this would have already ended. The fact that Ukraine has stopped Russia without that kind of commitment from the U.S. and the rest of Europe tells you how strong Ukraine is, but also the trouble that Russia is in. So at the end of the day, this is going to be about political will, and our leaders explaining why this is to our advantage, our best strategic interest, that Ukraine is successful.
Sir, do you believe that there is a chance for Ukraine to deoccupy territories without having European or American boots on the ground?
I would never say never on that, partly because of how Ukraine has improved and gotten better and stronger as the war has progressed, as you have grown your own defense industry. And of course, on the other side, you have the Russians, who are in big trouble economically and on the battlefield. So, war, because it's a test of will, you don't know where the other side, when they crack. And very often it comes all of a sudden. So I think that Vladimir Putin, of course, has zero interest in any kind of a real peace settlement. It's hard to imagine him saying, "Okay, we're leaving. You can have Crimea back or Zaporizhia." All of these things. But he may not be the one that gets to make that choice. So I would never say there's no way that Ukraine can restore its sovereignty. And frankly, I hope that Europe will see that it is in all of our interests that happens, and that Europe finds ways to help as well.
Sorry, I'd really like to know your thoughts about NATO membership for Ukraine, because this is something that was questioned since 2008, probably. Ignoring the fact that some of Ukraine's territories are occupied, do you think Ukraine is prepared to join NATO if such opportunity emerges tomorrow? Are we ready?
Well, I think the bigger question is, are the members of NATO ready? Because in my view, NATO would get stronger immediately the day that Ukraine joined. I mean, you would bring hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers, lots of capability, a very good young defense industry, and a population that is resilient. And so I think we would get better immediately. But there are still, unfortunately, some countries that have a problem, either because of old problems with Ukraine, such as Hungary, or because there are some that have still have this belief that Russia might actually use a nuclear weapon, which I think is not ever going to happen. But these are the kind of things that have to be overcome. But Ukraine, of course, look, none of us are perfect, including the U.S. or Germany or UK. And so Ukraine has plenty of things where they can continue to improve. I actually think getting EU membership first is even more important for Ukraine. And so meeting the requirements to be a member of the European Union is where I think the government should also be placing a lot of emphasis.
How do you think, is it technically and politically possible for the Article 5 to be applied to Ukraine while it is not a NATO member? How realistic and, most importantly, how reliable is such a solution?
I would be skeptical. I know that some people have suggested there's a way to do this. I just wouldn't call it Article 5. I mean, nations are sovereign entities. So the U.S., Germany, Poland, Finland, various countries could, in fact, Italy could, in fact, use force to support Ukraine if they wanted to. They're not restricted from doing that. And you don't have to do that through NATO. To call it Article 5, I mean, that's where an armed attack on one shall be considered an armed attack on all. But Ukraine is not in that all. So I don't know that that's the route that I would choose, but I'd be willing to hear somebody explain the advantages of it. What to me is more important is that the United States and other countries of Europe declare that it's their policy that Ukraine wins because it is in our interests, our economic interests, our diplomatic interests, our political interests, and in our security interests. That, to me, is the most important thing.
What are the biggest challenges faced by the NATO members nowadays?
Always the thing that is first has to be recognition of the threat. You know, agreeing that, yes, there is a threat. Russia is a threat. China is a threat. Iran is a threat. And so if you can acknowledge and agree that there is a threat, not just one, of course, there are several different threats that are out there, depending on where you are on the map. But agreeing on the threat, and then you can agree on steps to take to address the threat. That's always a challenge in an alliance. And then there are capabilities that are needed. This is not just about 2% or 3% or whatever the number is going to be. It's about making sure that you can protect your infrastructure, so air and missile defense, forces that are interoperable, the ability to move quickly, is faster than Russian forces. These are all things that require constant attention. So it's not just about how much money are you spending, but where are you spending it? Do you have the right level of readiness in your armed forces? So for every nation, these are challenges, and for the alliance, for me, agreeing on the threat.
Over the past few years, there were numerous reports from Western intelligence agencies about the possible future Russian invasion of Europe. General, do you think there's a possibility that Putin attacks a NATO country? Are there any gaps that Russia can exploit to make it happen?
Well, I absolutely believe that that's a possibility. The risk or the likelihood of that possibility goes up if the West allows Ukraine to fail, or if Russia sees that the U.S. doesn't care or that the alliance is coming apart, then that sort of weakness will invite aggression. But if they see that Europe is committed to helping Ukraine and that European countries are doing what needs to be done, and that the United States still has not unplugged, even if we've shifted priorities to the Indo-Pacific, then I think the Russians will be much more cautious about doing something. So in the meantime, what they're doing, of course, is these so-called gray zone activities that are below the level of Article 5, but yet they're destroying infrastructure, there's sabotage, there's all kinds of things that they are doing. And so the alliance has got to figure out policies and procedures to address those, and where Russia has to feel consequences for destruction of undersea cables, for example, or the sabotage they're doing around Europe.
In your opinion, can such acts of sabotage trigger Article 5?
Nothing triggers Article 5. Article 5 is a political decision. Okay, so I mean, you could have Russian airplanes fly all over Poland. there's no trigger. Okay, the way the Article 5 works is when one nation turns to the alliance and says, we've been attacked by Air Force, tanks, rockets, whatever, and then the nations would come together and make a decision. Did this constitute an Article 5 situation? And of course, that's only happened once in our history, and that was after 9/11, when all of our allies came to the aid of the United States. So the Russians are constantly probing, looking for vulnerabilities, pressing us, trying to divide us, and this is part of how they do it. So I'm reluctant to say that could trigger something, but until we make them feel consequences, they will continue doing this.
It's not a secret that European NATO members are dependent on the US-made weaponry and technology. And the biggest question I receive from our viewers is, can Europe defend itself against possible Russian invasion without the help from the US?
I would say absolutely. Of course, it'll be very difficult in the beginning. But look, Ukraine has stopped Russia. So just everybody should keep that in mind. Ukraine has stopped Russia. Nobody even talks about the Black Sea Fleet anymore. And the Russian Air Force, they drop bombs on Ukrainian cities, but they don't even fly into Ukraine to do that. So the question of whether or not Europe could defend itself against Russia, I would say absolutely. The combined economies of Europe dwarfs Russia's economy. And so it really is a matter of political will and doing the things necessary to unleash the potential of European industry as well as European armed forces. And even if the United States is not an active participant or reduces its role or whatever, NATO is still going to exist. And so you've got all these nations that have procedures, they work together, they know each other, they train together. And so I think some nations are beginning to look at this as an increasingly strong likelihood that they might have to do that without strong American help. And they ought to be able to do that. I mean, my goodness, after 80 years since the end of the war, Europe should be in a place where they can defend themselves. Now, they won't ever build as many nuclear weapons as what Russia has, but they don't have to have the same number. The Russians just need to believe that the French or the UK would use their nuclear weapons if necessary. So you have a nuclear deterrent. And the intelligence gap, if the U.S. stopped sharing intelligence with their allies, of course, that would have to be made up some other way. But, I'm not convinced that the administration is actually going to just completely back away, because that does not advance our interests in any way. Our intelligence gets a lot from other nations. This in various, not just Five Eye, but other intelligence sharing bilateral agreements. And there are thousands of U.S. businesses in Europe. And so the economic cost to us, if we just walked away and all of that was destroyed, I mean, that would be economically a catastrophe. Politically, that would be a catastrophe. So I'm not in the camp yet that says that the administration is just going to completely walk away.
A lot of people, and unfortunately a lot of opinion makers, consider Russia literally unstoppable. At the same time, over the past 3 years, Russia hasn't captured even a single major city in Ukraine. What does the current stalemate in Ukraine indicate to you? And to make it simple for our viewers, is Russia winning or losing?
Well, I think we are at a stage in the war where neither side can knock the other one out. Neither side, including the Russians, has the capacity to go on forever and ever at the current rate unless there's a change somewhere. One of the changes on the Ukrainian side is, of course, you're increasing your own defense capacity, and you're starting to see many European nations increase what they provide to Ukraine. So I think the Russians are the ones that are in the bigger trouble here. If we, the collective West, could do things to put more pressure on their economy, to stop them from being able to export oil and gas to China, for example, I think that it could become very difficult for the president of the Russian Federation.
My dear friends, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, known for his sharp strategic analysis and military expertise, has played a significant role in strengthening Europe's resilience against the Russian threat. If you found this discussion insightful, be sure to like, share and subscribe for more interviews with top experts as well as international volunteers helping Ukraine. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.